this video, we provide a lesson overview of lesson 8.1, which is about the basics of hypothesis testing. These slides are based on slides provided by Pearson to accompany our textbook and modified by me for our course. This is the first lesson in 3 lessons from chapter 8, which covers hypothesis testing that we'll be covering in our course. There is at least one more section about testing a claim about standard deviation or testing a claim about variance, but we won't be covering that due to time constraints. But lesson 8.1 is about the basics of hypothesis testing, and in 8.2 and 8.3 we're going to focus on testing claims about proportions and claims about means. This is the 8th chapter in Essentials of Statistics, 6th edition by Mario Triola. So here is the key concept of lesson 8.1. In this section, we're going to present key components of what's called a formal hypothesis test. There are 2 different versions of this formal hypothesis test, but they're just basically 2 different ways of looking at and quantifying exactly the same thing. So we're going to come up with the same conclusion, whether we use the critical value method or the p-value method. But both of those are formal hypothesis tests. The concepts in 8.1 are general and apply to hypothesis tests for proportions, means, standard deviations, or variances. Again, we're going to focus on hypothesis tests involving proportions and means in 8.2 and 8.3. So here are our learning outcomes. The first outcome has a lot to it, as you can see. It's really about the big picture of hypothesis testing. We're going to define some essential terms related to hypothesis testing, including the claim, the hypothesis, a null hypothesis, and alternative hypothesis. I'm sure you've heard the word hypothesis before, but it has a special meaning in statistics. And then we're going to describe hypothesis testing and how it relates to the rare event rule and sampling distributions. My goal for you is that by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to describe hypothesis testing in your own words. Also, by the end of the video covering learning outcome number 1, my hope will be that you'll be able to identify the null and alternative hypotheses associated with a given claim. So that's our first learning outcome. In our second learning outcome, we are gaining more tools and more skills relating to hypothesis testing. We're not quite ready to do a hypothesis test yet, but we're almost there. In learning outcome number 2, you're going to learn to define and interpret essential terms related to testing, including the significance level of a hypothesis test and type 1 and type 2 error. My goal for you is at the end of that video, you'll be able to identify type 1 error and type 2 error for a given hypothesis. And then in our third learning outcome, we're going to learn to compute test statistics corresponding to a sample proportion, a sample mean, and a sample standard deviation. Actually, we're just going to talk about where those test statistics come from, how they are related to the sampling distribution of that sample statistic that we started with, and then we'll do an example for a sample proportion. We won't do examples for sample mean and sample standard deviation, but you do have examples of that in the homework help playlist. And then finally, after learning outcomes number 1, 2, and 3, you're going to be ready to test a claim about a population proportion using the critical value method. So we're going to go through that method and talk about it and actually work on an example problem using the critical value method for testing a hypothesis about a population proportion. And then in learning outcome number 5, you're going to do the same thing, but instead of using the critical value method, you're going to use the p-value method. And then lastly, we're just going to talk about the power of a hypothesis test, and how the power is related to some of the other variables related to hypothesis testing. We're just going to talk about this qualitatively. My goal is that you will understand how power relates to other variables, and also that you'll be able to interpret the power of a hypothesis test. So that's the plan for lesson 8.1. I will see you in the first video to talk about the big picture of hypothesis testing, which is really about how it relates to sampling distributions of sample statistics and the rare event rule.